Justice has been a long time coming. At least that's what Breonna Taylor's friends and family members are saying. They, along with thousands of advocates, have been chanting, "Say her name," and justice for Breonna since March of 2020. That's when Breonna was shot and killed in the middle of the night by police officers in Louisville, Kentucky, during a botched raid on her apartment. This week, a major step toward accountability. The Justice Department announcing federal charges, particularly civil rights violations related to Breonna's death, against 4 current and former Louisville Metro Police Department officers. 3 of the 4 officers are being charged for allegedly falsifying information in the affidavit that was used to obtain the search warrant for Breonna's apartment before she was killed. 2 of them are also facing charges for lying following the shooting. Here's what Merrick Garland had to say about those charges on Thursday.
We allege that the defendants knew their actions in falsifying the affidavit could create a dangerous situation, and we allege these unlawful acts resulted in Ms. Taylor's death. The charges announced today also allege that the officers responsible for falsifying the affidavit that led to the search took steps to cover up their unlawful conduct after Ms. Taylor was killed. We allege that defendants Janes and Goodlette conspired to knowingly falsify an investigative document that was created after Ms. Taylor's death.
In addition to that, you may also recognize the name Brett Hankison. That's because he already faced state criminal charges in this case, but he was acquitted. Now he's facing federal civil rights violations, particularly 2 counts of deprivation of rights for firing 10 shots through Taylor's patio door during the raid, although none of the bullets hit anyone. For the record, NBC News has reached out to all 4 officers facing these new charges, and we haven't received any official responses. But here's part of what Tamika Palmer, Breonna Taylor's mother, had to say about it.
What we've been seeing on day one, y'all learning what we've been seeing was the truth, that they shouldn't have been there and that Breonna didn't deserve that. Y'all learning that today that we not crazy. Today's overdue, but it still hurts.
Joining me now to talk more about this story is MSNBC legal analyst Barbara McQuade. She's also a professor at the University of Michigan School of Law and a former United States attorney. Barb, my friend, thank you so much for being here. This is just the first in the steps towards justice for Breonna Taylor, but I want people to really understand what's the significance of these indictments and the DOJ's investigation to ultimately reach this point.
Well, Katie, I think this is one of those cases that everybody felt like such a grave injustice. How can it be that a woman is asleep in her home, completely innocent, and the police can bust down her door and shoot her dead? The challenge, of course, is that the law looks at the incident from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene. And so once an officer is lawfully in the apartment and someone is firing upon them, then they do have the ability to return fire for self-defense. But what the Justice Department has done here is actually really quite clever, is they've gone back a step. They've gone back to the obtaining of this warrant in the first place, because it turns out they weren't lawfully there when they fired those shots. And so by going back and finding that they had falsified the affidavit to get that no-knock warrant based on information about a former boyfriend selling drugs out of that location, that's where the crack and the fault line in this case was. And that's what they have focused on in these charges. It's really a very clever way of getting to criminal conduct that had been overlooked, I think, in focusing on the shooting itself.
Barb, I also think it's important for people to understand the process to even get that warrant in the first place, because as you know, that's where the DOJ honed in on to determine that the lies were obtained as the justification or the basis to get that search warrant to even get into Breonna Taylor's home in the first place. So can you let people understand how would a search warrant in this particular instance be obtained? We know that they were relying upon probable cause for that warrant based upon this idea that some drugs were being moved or purchased in and out of that home. But why would the cops' representations to a magistrate or a judge be so important to get that warrant in the first place?
Well, as you know, Katie, the Fourth Amendment protects all of us against unreasonable searches and seizures. And so before someone can bust into our home and rifle through our things, they have to satisfy to a judge that there is probable cause to believe that evidence of a crime will be found there. And it isn't just based on someone's say-so. They have to articulate the facts, and a judge reviews that affidavit and decides whether he or she agrees that there is probable cause. And so it's usually several pages long. It describes the investigation and all of the details that amount to probable cause. And what happened in this case is it turns out that they included false information about whether this former boyfriend was selling drugs out of this location. It represented that they had verified with the U.S. Postal Inspector Service that this person was living there and obtaining mail there, when in fact those facts allegedly were false. And so that level of detail that the judge relied upon in signing this turns out to have been based on lies. And so that's the part that is unconstitutional. It's a violation of the Fourth Amendment, and it amounts here to a criminal civil rights violation.
And why is that, Barb? Why is it that somebody dying, which obviously is a horrible thing to occur, why is it that you could get criminal charges based upon somebody lying to be able to get that warrant?
Yeah, there are federal civil rights statutes that say when people conspire to purposely deprive someone of a constitutionally protected right, here the right against unlawful searches and seizures, then it becomes a criminal offense. We've seen in these charges there is a couple of different charging documents, one based on the lies to obtain the search warrant, and then another based on the lies in the cover-up. So after this case occurred, after the death occurred, it alleges that the officers got together to cover their tracks, that they were worried that there could be criminal charges, and so that they conspired to lie about what they did. And so those two things are different violations of that federal civil rights statute that makes it a crime to knowingly deprive someone of their constitutional rights.
Barb, before I have to let you go, I also want to remind our viewers that there's a civil investigation, not criminal, but a civil investigation that was commenced by DOJ after this occurred back in 2020 to Breonna Taylor. It's similar to an investigation that was begun in Ferguson, Missouri, for example, after Michael Brown was killed. Also, the George Floyd death resulted in it. It's called a pattern and practice investigation. This idea of law enforcement having misconduct occurring over and over again, violations of people's civil rights. Can you talk briefly about why that type of investigation kind of runs parallel with this particular criminal issue and also is just as important?
Yes. So the criminal case focuses on this one particular incident and could result in prison for the officers involved. But it's just 4 officers. The pattern or practice investigation looks at the entire department and says, this incident didn't occur in isolation, that there are all kinds of policies, training, management practices that are in place that are just waiting for something like this to happen. And so there, the remedy would be recommendations and court orders to change the way of doing business there. In Ferguson, it resulted in changes to the way they were using the municipal court system as a fee generator. They were going out and rounding people up just to generate fees and revenues. And so in the same way, they'll take a long look at what's going on in terms of the practices in the Louisville Police Department and get a court order, if they prevail, that requires certain changes so that these kinds of things are just less likely to happen in the future.
Barbara, there's that saying, sometimes the cover-up is worse than the crime. Here, it sounds like the crime was just as bad. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today to explain and to break everything down. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Katie.